I used to rent a small one-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything special, but it was cheap, quiet, and gave me some much-needed privacy. This house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, surrounded by woods on three sides, with only one neighbor about a quarter mile away. At first, I loved how isolated it felt. But isolation has a way of turning comforting silence into something unsettling, especially at night. The first time I felt something was off was during a thunderstorm. The rain hammered against the windows, and I was curled up on the couch, reading. Out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw movement outside the front window. A dark figure, maybe just a shadow, standing by the tree line. I brushed it off as my imagination, a trick of the storm and poor lighting. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that crept up my spine. I remember double-checking that the doors were locked before I went to bed that night. A few nights later, I was in the kitchen making dinner. The blinds above the sink were drawn down halfway, but there was a small gap at the bottom. As I stood there chopping vegetables, I glanced up and froze. There were eyes too, pale and unblinking, staring back at me through that narrow gap. My knife clattered onto the counter as I stumbled back, but when I looked again, they were gone. I stood there in silence, my chest heaving, trying to convince myself I hadn't really seen it. Maybe a reflection, maybe headlights passing, anything but what it really looked like. I called my landlord the next morning, asking if there had ever been issues with trespassers. He laughed and told me it was just the woods playing tricks, and that no one ever came out that way. His dismissal should have comforted me, but it didn't. I started to notice other things, small things, that didn't add up. My back door, which I never used, would sometimes be unlocked in the morning. Items on my counter seemed slightly moved from where I'd left them. One night, I swore I heard someone breathing on the other side of my bedroom door. The worst night came about 3 weeks after moving in. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate crunches, coming closer to the house. I muted the TV and sat in total silence, straining to hear. The steps stopped right outside my front door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to peek through the peephole, but I was too terrified. After what felt like hours, I heard the creak of the porch steps, and then nothing. That night, I hardly slept. When morning came, I found muddy footprints on the porch, leading up to my door and back down again. They were large boot prints, much bigger than mine. I reported it to the police, but they barely took me seriously, telling me it was probably just a hunter who got lost. They didn't send anyone out to check. I was on my own. From then on, I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow and keeping the lights on. But the watching didn't stop. One evening, as I closed the curtains in my bedroom, I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. Across the yard, half hidden behind a tree, was a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing directly at my window. I could barely make out his face in the shadows, but I knew he was staring right at me. I shut the blinds immediately and backed away, shaking. I called 911, barely able to get the words out. An officer eventually came by, looked around, and told me he didn't see anything. By then, the man was long gone. They assured me it was probably just a prank, but to me, it didn't feel like a prank at all. It felt targeted, like someone had chosen me. The final straw came one night around 2 a.m. I woke up to a faint, scratching sound like fingernails on glass. My bedroom window was right by my bed, and I forced myself to turn my head slowly. What I saw nearly made me scream. A face pressed against the glass, eyes wide, mouth twisted, and a grin that didn't look human. He was so close I could see the fog of his breath against the glass. I froze, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to do something. After what felt like forever, I finally found the strength to grab my phone and dial 911. But the moment I sat up and reached for it, the face vanished into the darkness. The scratching stopped. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they searched around the house and found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Just like all the other times, there was no proof. I moved out within the week, breaking my lease and crashing on a friend's couch until I found somewhere else. To this day, I'll never forget that face at the window. The police might not have believed me, but I know what I saw, and I know someone out there was watching me. A few years ago, I lived in a second-floor apartment in a quiet residential neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it had a balcony that overlooked the parking lot. And at night, I liked to sit out there with a cup of tea, listening to the crickets. For the most part, it felt safe. But sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest things. One night, I was sitting on the couch with my laptop when I got that strange, heavy feeling, it's a sense that you're being watched. I brushed it off at first, but then I noticed something odd. Through the crack in the blinds, I could see the faint glow of a cigarette in the parking lot. It didn't seem unusual at first until I realized the ember wasn't moving. Whoever was smoking was just standing there, not pacing, not walking, just standing perfectly still, facing up toward my building. I told myself it could just be a neighbor. But the longer I stared, the more unsettling it felt. The person didn't leave. They just stood there, taking slow drags, the glow of the cigarette lighting up their face every few seconds. The worst part was, I couldn't make out their features, but I knew their eyes were angled toward my window. For the next half hour, I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, scrolling my phone, anything to ignore the unease. But every time I glanced back, that glowing ember was still there. By midnight, it was gone. I went to bed, convincing myself it had just been some guy on a smoke break. But the next night, at the exact same time, he was back. This time, I didn't just pick I went out onto the balcony to see better. The figure was standing in the same spot, motionless, head tilted slightly upward. The cigarette burned down. Then another was lit. I whispered hello into the night air, half expecting him to wave or shout something back. Nothing. He didn't move. A skin crawled as I backed into my apartment and shut the blinds tight. Over the next week, the man kept returning. Always in the same place. Always around midnight. Sometimes he didn't even smoke. He just stood there, looking up. I mentioned it to the landlord, who brushed it off as probably some random loiterer. The police didn't take me seriously either, since technically he wasn't trespassing. But I knew this was no random loiterer. He was watching me. The scariest night was the one I'll never forget. I had fallen asleep on the couch, with the TV still on. Around 12:15, I woke up suddenly, like something had jolted me out of a dream. The room was dim, only the glow of the screen lighting it. And then I noticed movement to shadow, shifting against the blinds. My heart stopped. I crept over and carefully lifted a slat, just enough to peek outside. The man wasn't in the parking lot anymore. He was standing directly below my balcony. No cigarette this time, just his face tilted up, staring straight at me. His expression was blank, almost lifeless, but his eyes, they locked onto mine the instant I looked out. I dropped the blinds and stumbled back, pulse racing so hard it hurt. I called the police immediately, whispering into the phone. When they arrived, 15 minutes later, the man was gone, just like every other time. The officer shined his flashlight around the lot and told me he couldn't find anything suspicious. But when I stepped out onto the balcony the next morning, I found something chilling. A single cigarette butt placed neatly on the railing. Not tossed, not dropped, placed there like a message. I couldn't stay there after that. I moved out a week later, breaking my lease just like I did for survival. To this day, I never learned who that man was or why he chose to watch me night after night. But sometimes, when I see someone smoking in the distance, my chest tightens, because I can't help but wonder if it was him and if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to notice the glow in the dark. When I was in college, I rented a small basement apartment off campus. It wasn't much, just one bedroom, a kitchen, and a living space, but it was cheap and gave me independence. The downside was that all the windows sat at ground level, so anyone walking by could see straight in if the blinds weren't shut. At first, I didn't think much of it. I realized how exposed it made me feel. The first time I noticed something strange was late one night while I was studying. The blinds in the living room cracked just a little for some fresh air. Out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a faint tapping on the glass. I froze, listening, then slowly turned my head. For just a split second, I saw movement like someone's hand pulling away from the window. I rushed over, yanked the blinds shut, and told myself it was just a tree branch, or maybe my imagination. A few nights later, I was brushing my teeth when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside my bedroom window. Slow, steady crunches, coming closer. I stood completely still, toothbrush in hand, staring at the glass. And then I saw a tan outline, a head and shoulders, barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp. Whoever it was, they were standing perfectly still, facing my window. My stomach dropped. I turned off the bathroom light, hoping the sudden darkness would make them leave. But the shadow didn't move. I called a friend of mine, whispering into the phone. She told me to call campus security, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. No footprints, no proof, just me looking paranoid. For a while, I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Sometimes, when I walked into the living room, the hairs on my neck would stand up, and I'd find myself staring at the blinds, convinced someone was on the other side. The worst part came one Saturday night. I had some classmates over, and we were hanging out, playing music, and eating pizza. At one point, my friend Sarah went to grab another drink from the fridge. Suddenly, she froze and asked, "Who's that guy outside?" We all rushed over, but by the time we looked, there was nothing. Sarah swore she saw a man crouched near the window, watching us. Everyone laughed it off as her imagination, but I knew she wasn't making it up. A few weeks later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise I'll never forget. It was the sound of a window sliding open. My heart started pounding as I lay frozen in bed, staring at the darkness of my bedroom. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, not mine, someone else's, just outside the window. I slowly reached for my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line until police arrived. Minutes dragged on like hours. The breathing stopped, replaced by silence. When the officers finally knocked on my door, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. They checked the windows and found clear signs of tampering scratches near the latch where someone had tried to pry it open. But just like every other time, the intruder was gone without a trace. The police suggested I stay with friends until I could get the locks and windows reinforced. I packed a bag that same night and never spent another night in that basement. When I came back days later to grab the rest of my stuff, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the inside of the glass, pressed against the foggy surface of my bedroom window, was a handprint. Perfectly clear, like someone had been watching me from just inches away and waiting for the right moment to come in. I'll never know who it was or how long they had been out there, standing just beyond the glass, watching me sleep. All I know is, if Sarah hadn't seen that figure, or if I hadn't woken up that night when I did, I might not have been the one telling this story. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories.